Welcome to One With the Other Way, a podcast about your journey and finances. I'm your host, James, and today we're talking about emergency funds, their purpose, how much to put in them, and where's the best place to keep them. Hope you enjoy the episode. And today we're in Chicago for our team's offsite, and it's a wonderful day here in Chicago. We have Wanda and Peggy with us, our two advisors, and today we're going to talk to you about emergency funds.
First thing, right, let's talk about purpose. When we think about a purpose for emergency savings, what comes to mind, Peggy? What do you think?
Loss of your job.
Yeah, I definitely think about loss of job. And so when you think about loss of job, the way you want to look at this for emergency savings is how long would it take for you to get another job in the event you lost your job? And for every job skill, that's different, but you know personally what it would take. What's another kind of emergency that we might have?
You might have a medical expense.
Oh, yeah, medical expense, right? We do think about medical expenses quite a bit. And medical costs, as we know, can be quite expensive. With the Healthcare Act, a lot of people don't realize that there's a maximum out-of-pocket expense over the course of the year. So once they spend X amount of dollars, then the insurance company must step in. And for families, it's right around $19,000, and for an individual, it's about $9,000. And so again, when we're thinking about using an emergency fund for medical expense, we're thinking about medical. So if you have a family, about 19,000, and if you're an individual, about 10,000.
Well, I just wanted to add to that you should check your insurance policy. Every insurance policy states what your maximum out of pocket is, and that would be the number. It's not necessarily just what's mandated, but you should always check your own policy and see what it is for your max out of pocket.
Yeah, that's definitely true, right? Because yours is definitely different. And it actually sets aside that fear for medical, like how much can I spend for medical? Knowing your own number actually helps you to say, hey, I know if I spend this much, right? Because your company policy might even be 10,000 or 12,000 or something, which is less than the mandate. You're right.
Right.
And then one of the things I always think about for emergency savings, for me, I always, not because it happens a lot, but a car accident, right? Whatever your deductible is for a car accident, you should have that ready cash so that if you do have a car accident, you can cover the deductible for your car expense. I'm trying to think what other kind of emergencies would be out there.
An act of God.
An act of God.
That's true. A natural disaster is a good point. That could be, and you would definitely need some emergency cash in that case.
Yeah, right. I remember the floods of 2023. We're going to call it the floods of 2023, Peggy, when you were building trenches around your house to push the water away. That's an act of God.
It was a crazy day, that's for sure. I mean, that was very unusual. That day we got like 7.5 inches of rain in one day.
Yeah,
especially for California. That's a lot.
California, it was pretty wild, yeah.
So have we covered all the purposes of emergency savings? We've talked about loss of income, medical, car accidents. Any other emergencies that you might think of that you might need?
Well, no, but I'm sure everybody's going to have something different. There might be some family expense that you have. Mm-hmm. I think that we should just, excuse me, we should just be clear that, and maybe we should differentiate what is an emergency and wants and needs, right? So your emergency fund is for actual true emergencies. It's not for, in case I need that new luggage set for that vacation or something.
Although new luggage sets for a vacation is pretty amazing. So definitely emergencies are different than wants, and they're definitely needs. And so when you're thinking about how much you need for emergency savings, that bracket there for our individual takes 3 or 4 months to find a job, and then depending on medical deductible, but sitting down with someone, maybe considering what emergencies would be in your family, then would determine how much you need to have in emergency savings for your individual situation. Each one of us being unique to what an emergency is for ourselves.
Yeah. Well, before we go into that, I guess a question that comes to my mind is that, some of these seem like large amounts of money to save up for people who don't have the ability to just quickly set aside, for a family, for instance. You had mentioned the $19,000 for, your maximum out of pocket for a family. How do you, work with a family that's, maybe they aren't able to do that currently, how do you help them maximize their emergency fund?
You save it as best you can over time, and we can discuss it with them and look at their budget and see where in their current income where they can find some of that money. And so we just look at their cash flow and discuss it with them, and then decide how much to set aside. I mean, you have to look at your own. I mean, it's not as simple as just, oh, it's 19,000, you're kind of stuck on that number. That's a really big number.
Yeah.
For me, even for my family, I don't need that much. Right. I mean, and yes, it would probably take me a long time to find a job, but there are other factors. You could factor in things like, well, depending on how you lost your job, you might actually have a little bit of income from, say, an unemployment insurance or some other method that you would have income. Maybe you lost your job, but you're disabled. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. We're just using kind of round numbers, large numbers, worst case numbers, which, we kind of like to use worst case in a way so that you're kind of prepared, right? But I think that really you need to sit down and talk to somebody and look at your own personal situation in order to make a informed decision. And then you talk about your budget and your cash flow and where does that money come from? And then you plan and start putting it away. I mean, it's just like everything else. You have to take the first step, right? Start.
True. You have to take the first step and start, which actually it is a big number. You're right, James. And I tend to like broad stroke a lot of things. And I love that, Peggy, you look at those kind of details. You're exactly right. It is dependent on your individual situation. In fact, the Census Bureau has said about 2/3 of Americans do not have $400 for emergency savings. And so when you think about, okay, 400, and you're talking about 20,000, that seems like a big mountain to climb. Yet, as Peggy says, the way to tackle that is one step at a time. As with all things that are important, you take the first step and then the second step to get you to the place that you need to go. And looking at what your resources is, if this is how much your income is, how much can I realistically set aside to get to that goal? It doesn't mean necessarily that you'll have the emergency savings that you need in the first month or 2 months. It might take a couple years to get to that space that you have the emergency savings. But the important thing is to take the first step, decide what you need, and then work towards that goal in a reasonable time. I mean, not believing you can do it overnight, because nothing of value seems to happen overnight. It always takes time, right?
Now, this kind of leads into the next part of, taking those next steps. And the natural thing that comes to my mind is, well, where do I even put my emergency fund? Because there are multiple options. So if you wouldn't mind speaking in a little bit about the different options people have for where they could store their emergency fund.
I keep mine in the mattress.
Do you really keep yours under a mattress?
Of course not.
Well, no, not necessarily.
I do not know. And I wouldn't recommend that for anyone. I know people who have like rather large amounts of money on a cash in hand. Well, I call it large amounts of money. Other people don't. But yes, where do you keep it? There's a lot of options. You're correct. You could keep it in your bank. You could put it in a money market. You could put it in a savings account. There are a lot of options again. And I think that this also is, I don't know, I feel like a broken record. Depends on your personal situation.
Why do we always come back to the idea of personal situation? So a lot of these topics can be scary to address. I think the important thing is to address them, and having a financial professional, I think, might be a good way to address them, because they are scary, but taking a look at them with your eyes open to figure out what works for you. And it's not one solution fits all, but it's the solution that works for you.
And then it also depends on how much it is. So if you have somebody who's their emergency fund only needs to be, I don't know, $5,000. I don't know who that would be, but $5,000, it might just be worth to just, put it into your savings account at your local bank. But if it's $20,000, then you might want to think about looking for something where you're going to get a little bit of return on that money so that it's not taking such a big hit, say with inflation or whatever. So the amount of your emergency fund is going to play into where you're going to want to store it.
What are some, I guess, key factors in searching for a place to store it?
So we addressed purpose, right? And then we talked about amounts and varying amounts situationally, depending on your amount. The other thing is the mechanics. We're going to set aside regular amounts of money to build it. It doesn't happen overnight, but where to put the money. And so, I think this is important. Maybe not under the mattress, Peggy, but maybe in a place that you can't quite touch every day or that you can't quite see. So if you're using your local bank and you're on your debit card and you're using, your checking account and that kind of thing for your daily expenses, maybe you don't want the emergency savings there, so it's not so readily accessible. So that you're taking it and taking it one step away from your daily living things, so that it's not as easily accessible. It needs to be liquid, right? You need to be able to access it for emergencies because that is what it's there for. But maybe if you say, hey, I'm going to turn it into this high yield savings account so that I can get a little bit of interest. And so it's one step removed from my daily financial budget or what I'm spending money on, that sort of thing. Maybe not CDs necessarily, because CDs will generally, the way the CD rules are written, you don't get the interest if you take the money out. But something like a money market savings account has potentially a higher yield than a savings account accessible to you by check. And so that might be a tool to use. And really, it's easy to go ahead and get an internet search and find some of these sources for either a high yield savings account or a money market account. Is there other places besides? And I got to tell you, I kind of like the mattress because I've always have a fear of what if I don't have enough money for XYZ? And so, yeah, money is a fear for all of us, even as long as I've been in the industry. The fear of not having money even affects me, plagues me sometimes, I think to say, right?
Some people, don't put it in your freezer. That whole thing about your credit cards. If you don't want to use your credit cards, put them in a baggie, fill it with water, and put it in your freezer. So it takes you a long time to go get it. Don't do that with your cash. I mean, I wouldn't do that with your credit cards either.
Okay, that brings us to a
Well,
very good topic, because we will address credit cards at a later time. And I've also heard that story about the credit cards in the freezer, and I kind of liked it. And Peggy, you're not liking it, so we'll have to address
Well,
that
I mean, it
another
is.
time.
Yeah, exactly. We'll talk about that in another episode.
Yeah.
well, I think we should mention quickly though. What about people who, think it's let's use my credit card as my emergency fund? Because I grew up, at least, we had an emergency credit card. For if anything happened, this is what I should use.
Well, the way that you grew up, I'm sure that they gave you the credit card because you were young. And here, if there's an emergency, use this. An emergency. What would have been an emergency? I got a flat tire. I, need to get a new tire right away. I mean, I have those kind of things too. And you do occasionally use your credit card for something like that. And then you pay it off at that same month. So, the caution on using your credit card as your emergency fund is the amounts. You don't want it to be your actual emergency fund, because it's, you're going to pay a lot in interest. And so you're going to get penalized, and then you're going to get behind. If you use it in the immediate need, okay, there's a natural disaster and my house is flooded, or, some other thing, and I have to evacuate, say, I can use my credit card to pay for my hotel until I can go and access my emergency fund, right?
That makes
So
sense.
I think in that regard, you can use your credit card in the near term for the immediate, today I have to do something. And, you have to get safe, or you have to get the tire or whatever, or the smaller emergencies. And the difference of an emergency for a parent giving the credit card to the child, saying in an emergency use this, is I think a very different thing than a family having an emergency fund.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'd like to also address, there's this concept of an emergency fund for loss of job, medical, and an accident, right? You think about that, but you think about these things of life, like a flat tire, or I might need a hotel room. And I compartmentalize that a little bit to like discretionary. You should have in your family, depending on your lifestyle, somewhere around $300 to $1,000 a month for these things that are like not really an emergency, but I need to cover a hotel. And then that should be able to come from your credit card, and then that you should pay off every month. And I was looking again at the Census Bureau statistic, and they said it seemed to me about 3 or 4% of us actually use credit cards for that's considered our emergency savings. Those three categories that we're talking about: loss of income, medical, and accident. That about 3 or 4% of Americans are actually using their credit cards for that, and it's mostly the younger generation because of mindset. I wonder if it has to do with that. When you grew up, you had a family credit card for emergencies, James. Maybe.
Maybe so. I don't know.
I think it has to do with a large percentage of families in the United States don't have $400 in the bank. So if they don't have $400 in the bank, but they have a credit card, that's going to be their emergency fund. I mean, it's sad to say.
And that's 2/3 of all Americans. So I guess the important thing is to address the issue. Take a look at that emergency savings, address the issue, identify your purposes, identify how much the amount needs to be in your situation, and take the first steps to make it happen for yourself to get to the other place so that you can be in the top third of all Americans, right? So you can figure it out in your situation.
So thank you for joining us today for a discussion about your emergency fund. We hope that you will all take steps to better your financial position by establishing an emergency fund. If you would like to talk to one of us and make an appointment, that would be great. Please visit our website, Finances for Real Life, to do that. And join us another time to discuss credit cards.
Great. And thank you for all listening. Find us at financesforreallife.com. You can click the schedule button to schedule an appointment with one of Wanda or Peggy. And yeah, we're going to go enjoy the rest of our time in Chicago. So we hope to see you in the next episode. Securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Investment advice offered through Finances for Real Life, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from LPL Financial. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision.